Peter Hitchens, who is giving a lecture to the Warwick Politics Society tonight about the fact he doesn't think there has been a war on drugs, and it's followed by a question and answer session. I think we'll start off, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us firstly.
So far, it's a pleasure.
Why do you not think there's been a war on drugs? Because that seems quite...
Why do you put it like that? Why do I not think that there's been a war on drugs? Every time I do a meeting on drugs at any university in this country, the first thing I do is to ask everybody present to raise their hands if they've taken illegal drugs. Everybody does, without exception. If there were a war on drugs, would that be true? Would they, first of all, have done it? Secondly, would they own up to it in a public place? No. It's an absurdity to suggest that there's any serious attempt in this country to suppress or indeed discourage the use of illegal drugs. There isn't one.
Why do
you need to tell me why you think there is.
I was saying, why do you think the phrase has become so popular now? Because it's used by a lot of people. It seems to be
because slogans are a good substitute for thought, and people find thinking difficult, painful, and troublesome, so they don't bother. Thought is very rare. It's especially rare in universities.
On the subject of drugs, sort of ideas like addiction and withdrawal, do you think those are real things, or do you think they're...
Well, withdrawal is a real thing, just as a hangover is a real thing. But there's a very strange, fake logic here, that because when you stop taking a drug you get nasty symptoms, you're therefore compelled to start taking it again. It doesn't follow. You aren't compelled to start drinking again just as you wake up with a bad headache. And there's no logic in that. To suggest from the fact that people get hangovers or withdrawal symptoms that there is such a thing as addiction is fatuous, if addiction is what it is claimed to be. And here's the difficulty with addiction: it's a shapeshifter. People use it in two different ways. The legal system, and indeed the medical profession, increasingly use it as if it were an overpowering force that people can't resist. And yet, in other contexts, they talk about it as something people can overcome. Well, it can't be both. And in any normal discourse, that contradiction between the two meanings would make people realise that the thing is a nonsense. But because it's so fashionable to believe in addiction, nobody thinks about it. Again, the problem here is getting people to think about what they say, and which is extremely difficult to do, because by and large people will say what is acceptable, what won't get them into trouble, what won't lose them friends, what in many cases, increasingly this is the real disgrace of the academy, gets them reasonable grades on their essays and eventually in their examinations as well. If you stick to the conformist line, you'll do fine. It's just you won't be doing any thinking. So what are you doing here?
You mentioned then that you ask people if they've taken drugs, and a lot of people say they have.
Practically
everyone. And obviously drugs are very harmful, there's evidence that shows that. But what is the way then to tackle the issue at its root then, of people taking drugs, do you think?
People under 25 think they're immortal, so it's absolutely no use issuing health warnings. Apart from anything else, they're not credible. People will not believe, because they've seen plenty of people who've taken drugs and have not immediately fallen dead at their feet. They know that people who claim that this is what's going to happen are lying, and they will laugh at it. The dangers of many drugs are cumulative. I know of cases of people who've taken cannabis perhaps for 40 years and believed it was safe, who've suddenly had to be dragged off by a dozen policemen to the locked ward because they've finally lost their reason. But that's not a thing you can predict. The whole problem with the difficulties of cannabis and mental illness is that mental illness is itself a very hard to define thing. And it's also very difficult to decide when it affects people. Some people may get away with it. I think the simplest way of putting people off doing something which is dangerous when they're young is to warn them that there will be practical consequences. If you know that if you're caught in possession of an illegal drug, you will be prosecuted. If you know that on, say, a second offence you will go to prison. If you know that if you're caught you will never ever be able to travel to the United States and that many professions will be closed to you, you won't do it. You won't have to be told this will kill you. You won't have to be told this will send you to a gibbering idiot. You'll just know it's a stupid thing to do, and you will be able, above all, to resist a huge peer pressure. Oh, go on. Why don't you do it? Come on, join us. Do what everybody else is doing, which is enormous. It will give people a serious, rational reason to reject and resist peer pressure, which is all most people need to avoid doing something stupid.
Now, government policy seems to be sort of moving in the direction of decriminalisation of drugs like cannabis.
It's not moving in the direction of. Government policy has been
so you think
de facto decriminalisation, a policy pursued more or less since 1971.
Do you think it's likely that we're going to see sort of a de jure decriminalisation?
It's more difficult because this country is a member of the UN Security Council and is a signatory of several treaties which oblige it to maintain on the books serious laws against certain named drugs. Trivial countries or funny countries like Canada can get out of it because they're not in the Security Council. The United States can get out of it by saying, we as a federal government still maintain this law, but the states, which of course aren't members of the United Nations Security Council, do what they like, but we can't. So there is a huge and very well-financed billionaire campaign at the moment to overturn those international treaties. And when that comes, I think the what I call billionaire big dope is poised to become the new big tobacco, and the legalization of these substances, which will, when it comes, be enormous commercially, is something very likely to happen, possibly in my lifetime, certainly in yours.
What do you think will be the consequences then of carrying on with this de facto decriminalisation for society as a whole?
The consequences will be that a large number of people will suffer for the sake of the profit of others, and that seems to me to be morally reprehensible, something any sensible person would resist.
Moving on from drugs, you were recently at Warwick University for the Debating Society speaking about grammar schools.
Yes.
That's something that has been in the news recently, but I mean, there's not many grammar schools left in the UK. I think there's 163 something.
163.
Why do you think governments, the current government, have just started to sort of flirt with the idea of reintroducing them?
Well, public relations. There's no evidence at all, for instance, that Mrs May is particularly keen on the policy, but she is a Prime Minister in search of a policy. Anyone who rises to the top of politics, and you will have seen this in the speech that she gave on Monday, is very badly in need of some way of making themselves look respectable. Evelyn Waugh said politicians don't pursue office to implement policies. They pursue policies so that they can get into office, and once they're in office, they need something to make them look as if they're intellectually coherent. So Mrs May lighted upon grammar schools, partly because one of her advisors, Nick Timothy, is very keen on them as something which she would make part of her image. She doesn't have any real enthusiasm for it, I don't believe. She went to a grammar school herself and kept this out of reference books for many years. And it's only because, actually, largely because I pushed it over and over again, that it even began to be mentioned as part of her past. So it's a gimmick as far as they're concerned. As far as I'm concerned, it's a necessary and important educational reform which might bring some sense back to an extremely unfair educational system biased heavily towards the rich, which we have at the moment.
Do you think then the grammar schools that perhaps use the 11 plus tuition, the 11 plus test that can potentially be bought by sort of middle class parents by tutoring their children, do you think that would sort of make the system more equal?
This is a result of the fact that there are hardly any grammar schools. There used to be something like 12 or 1300, and at that time anybody who knew anything about it accepted there were too few, especially in quite large areas of the south of England. So the idea that 163 grammar schools concentrated largely in metropolitan commuter areas, where well-off middle-class people could save themselves £100,000 in post-tax income by getting their child into a grammar school, that they would not then use every conceivable wile and method to get their children into them, is absurd. Of course they will, but that doesn't tell you what a national selective education system would be like. Germany, which has a national selective education system, does not have this problem, because it has a national selective education system, and in every area there are good state schools which people can get into on the basis of their ability. And as a result, Germany has almost no private education. I think most of us would prefer that here if we possibly could. But to constantly whine about the fact that the tiny rump of remaining grammar schools are besieged by middle-class parents trying to get their children into good schools is a trivial diversion from the actual issue of whether we should have selection by money, as we have now, or selection by ability, as we used to have and as we could have again.
You spoke then about the education system, in your view, being unequal. You spoke as well about drugs being increasingly in use. As you said, there's no war on drugs. I think you've urged people as well to kind of leave Britain, because you don't believe Britain's going in the right direction.
When people ask me, I find it immensely frustrating doing serious research as I do on policy issues, so that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to both the two subjects we've just discussed. I know about the issue of drugs and I know about the issue of selective education in some detail, and to find the huge barrier of stupidity and inertia which faces anybody such as me on this policy or several others I could name, where you can say what we're doing now is foolish and wrong and ought to be changed for the better. There is no point of entry for someone like me in British politics. I could never be elected to Parliament. If by any strange, mad mischance I were to be elected to Parliament, I'd be a powerless individual, because none of the parties would be remotely interested in the things that I say. We have a dead political system devoted to protecting the existing inertia and folly which we have. And if people say to me, what would you do if you were me, that is to say someone in his 20s or 30s or her 20s or 30s with a life ahead of them, I would say leave this country and get out of it now while you still can. Because on top of that, the economic and social problems of this country are so huge that the dislocation and misery which lie ahead, as far as I can see, are enormous. And the longer you leave it, the harder it is to get out. And I started saying some years ago, I said, get out while the pound sterling is still worth something. And I knew perfectly well that the pound sterling was going to start to fall. So when it fell by 20% after the referendum vote, I wasn't in the least bit surprised. And I'll sit here and tell you now, it's going to fall a lot more than that before it's over. And it will be probably worth less than the US dollar by, well, within 2 or 3 years. So with that rate of depreciation, which is a genuine recognition by the world of the actual state of our economy, it gives you an idea of how much the world values our supposed economic recovery and our supposed economic miracle. They don't think much of it, and rightly so, it doesn't exist. And if people say, well, where would you go? I say, you won't be in a position to decide. You'll be a supplicant. You'll be asking people to take you in. It won't be you saying, oh, I would like to go down the travel agent, I would like to go to X country or there. Who will take you? Who's going to want British qualifications? Who's going to want to take you on and retrain you to do a job properly that the British education system has possibly failed to do? I don't know. But I certainly can't advise you where to go.
Moving away from British politics for a second, what do you think of the election of Donald Trump? Do you think he's going to improve America's position in the world? Or?
I think Donald Trump is an oaf and a yahoo. He may be quite cunning, and cunning people are very dangerous in politics. Remember that Princess Diana was nobody's idea of an academic genius or an intellectual, but she had an immense vixen-like cunning, and she ran rings around all the politicians of her time. And Donald Trump seems to me to have many of her characteristics. He's much faster in thought than people who are much better educated than him. And this is sometimes the case in politics. Whether he is actually going to be able to assemble around him intelligent people who can put intelligent policies into practice is another matter. But I will never back away from saying that he is an oaf and a yahoo, because he so obviously is, and it would be ridiculous to pretend otherwise. Even though there are a number of issues where I think his policies are a good deal more sensible than those of Hillary Clinton, who I also dislike intensely as a political figure. I don't matter as a person. And the main benefit from Donald Trump's election was immediate, which was pretty much the end of the policy of flattening Syria on behalf of Saudi Arabia, which the United States had adopted. And the Syrian war is now, I think, coming to an end because Donald Trump won that election. And Hillary Clinton, who would have continued the war until every building in Syria was flat and every occupant of that country a refugee, now has no hope of office. So that has to be a good thing, especially if you're Syria.
Just finally, when we announced we were doing this interview, a couple of people asked us to ask you about why you don't like the idea of a skinny cappuccino as a sort of...
I just think it's particularly ridiculous that chains like Pret a Manger, which announced natural food in big letters on their shops, will not make coffee using whole milk. They insist on using what I would describe as workhouse milk or prison milk, this wretched white water, which is not